The rain lashed against the windows of the stately Georgian mansion in Charleston, South Carolina. Outside, the storm raged with a ferocity that seemed to mirror the tension brewing inside the Calloway household. Constance Calloway, elegant yet weary, stepped lightly through the dimly lit hallway. The house was unusually quiet, with her children, Reed and Isla, already asleep. It was a rare moment of solitude, but tonight, it felt oppressive. Something was wrong, she could feel it in the air. Her steps carried her toward the door of Emmett's study. She paused, her hand hovering over the ornate brass doorknob. Constance had grown accustomed to her husband retreating into this room late at night, burying himself in work, or so he claimed. But tonight, there was no familiar sound of a pen scratching on paper, no shuffling of documents. It was utterly silent. Pushing the door open, Constance gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The scene before her was one she would never forget. Scarlett, their niece, lay crumpled on the floor, her lifeless eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Her once vibrant face was now pale and still, and her auburn hair was spread out like a dark halo against the polished hardwood. Emmett sat frozen in his chair, his head in his hands, his frame hunched over as though crushed by the weight of the world. "Emmett," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her husband didn't respond, didn't even lift his head. The only sound was the relentless pounding of the rain outside, a macabre backdrop to the horror inside. Forcing herself to move, Constance rushed to Scarlett's side. Her shaking hands hovered over the girl's motionless body, afraid to touch her, afraid of what she already knew to be true. Tears blurred her vision as she turned to Emmett, her voice rising in panic. "What happened? What did you do?" When he finally looked up, his face was ashen, his eyes hollow. "It was an accident," he mumbled, the words barely audible. But the streaks of red on his hands and the bruises on Scarlett's neck told a different story. Constance stumbled back, her mind reeling. This couldn't be real. This wasn't the man she married, the father of her children, the pillar of their community. Her trembling fingers fumbled for her phone as she dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, methodical, but Constance could barely find the words to explain what had happened. "There's been an incident," she choked out. "My niece, she's not breathing." Minutes later, the distant wail of sirens pierced the night. Blue and red lights flashed against the rain-slicked windows as officers and paramedics descended upon the house. Constance watched in a daze as they moved quickly, their questions and commands blending into a blur of noise. Emmett was led away in handcuffs, his face devoid of any emotion, while Scarlett's body was carefully covered and carried out into the storm. As the front door slammed shut behind the paramedics, Constance sank to the floor, her tears falling unchecked. The perfect life she had fought so hard to maintain had shattered in an instant. Outside, the storm began to subside, but inside the Calloway mansion, the echoes of betrayal and tragedy were only just beginning. The Calloway family had always been admired, almost envied, in Charleston's elite circles. Their Georgian mansion stood as a symbol of wealth, power, and legacy, a structure meticulously maintained, much like the image they presented to the world. Behind the iron gates and manicured lawns, however, lay a family whose polished veneer concealed fractures threatening to split them apart. At the center of it all was Emmett Calloway, a man who had built his empire from the ground up. Born into a modest family in Savannah, Georgia, Emmett was a testament to grit and determination. His father, a construction worker, and his mother, a homemaker, instilled in him a relentless drive to succeed. That drive took him to the Ivy Leagues, where he excelled in business studies before returning to the South to establish Calloway Realty, a real estate empire synonymous with success in Charleston. Standing tall with sharp, salt and pepper hair, Emmett exuded confidence and charm. He could walk into a room and command attention effortlessly. At 47, he was at the height of his career, overseeing multi-million-dollar developments while serving on charitable boards and hosting fundraisers for the city's elite. To many, Emmett was the epitome of the American dream, a man who had it all: wealth, respect, and a picture-perfect family. But those who knew him well, or thought they did, sensed the restlessness beneath his success. The deals, the accolades, even the lavish parties seemed to lose their luster. Emmett often retreated to his study, drowning in bourbon and work, searching for something more, something to fill the growing void in his life. That emptiness, though hidden from the public eye, was the fault line through which his carefully constructed world would begin to crumble. Beside him was Cassandra Calloway, his wife of nearly 2 decades. Cassandra was everything a Southern matriarch was expected to be: graceful, poised, and fiercely loyal to her family. She had traded her dreams of becoming an artist for the life of a socialite, seamlessly navigating Charleston's high society alongside Emmett. But beneath her composed exterior, Cassandra felt the strain of holding together a marriage that had grown cold. She had noticed the subtle changes in Emmett over the years: the late nights at the office, the quiet withdrawal from her and their children. She told herself it was stress from his work, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. Still, Cassandra remained steadfast. She hosted charity luncheons, attended galas on her husband's arm, and managed their 2 children with the precision of a general. Reed, 15, was the eldest, a quiet but sharp teenager who seemed more interested in his sketchpad than the family's high society obligations. Isla, just 12, was still wide-eyed and innocent, her laughter often the only thing that brought life back into the somber household. Then there was Scarlett Calloway, the niece who had come to live with them just a few months earlier. Scarlett's arrival was a sudden, almost desperate move. Her parents' tumultuous divorce had left her floundering, and Emmett had offered her a chance at stability. For Scarlett, the Calloway mansion represented a fresh start, a sanctuary from the chaos of her past. At 21, Scarlett was bright and ambitious, a journalism major at College of Charleston with dreams of uncovering the world's hidden truths. She had a knack for getting to the heart of a story, her professors often marveling at her tenacity. But Scarlett's hunger for truth wasn't confined to her studies. She was observant, almost too much so, and her curiosity often led her into places she shouldn't go. Scarlett had always idolized her Uncle Emmett. To her, he was everything her own father wasn't: strong, successful, and dependable. Living under his roof had initially felt like a dream come true, but that dream began to shift as she grew closer to him. Scarlett noticed things no one else seemed to see: the fleeting sadness in Emmett's eyes, the way he lingered over his bourbon late at night. Her admiration turned into a fixation, and slowly, without her realizing it, the boundaries of their relationship began to blur in her mind. Unbeknownst to Cassandra or Scarlett, Emmett's growing dissatisfaction with his life had found an outlet in Victoria Ashcroft, a striking art curator from Savannah. At 39, Victoria was cultured, intelligent, and fiercely independent, everything Cassandra used to be before years of devotion to family life dulled her edges. Emmett had met Victoria at a fundraiser 2 years prior, and what began as intellectual camaraderie had evolved into a secret affair. Victoria had no illusions about her role in Emmett's life. She knew he was married, and though she told herself she was content with stolen moments, her feelings for him deepened. Recently, she had begun to push for more, hinting that Emmett should leave Cassandra and start a new life with her. It was a demand he wasn't ready to face. As the weeks passed, the Calloway family's facade of perfection began to crack. Scarlett's sharp eyes noticed the tension between her aunt and uncle, the way Emmett's phone always seemed to buzz with messages he wouldn't explain. Cassandra, too, felt the growing distance but dismissed her instincts, convincing herself she was imagining things. The truth, however, was far more dangerous than any of them realized. Beneath the glittering exterior of the Calloway household, hidden desires, secrets, and lies simmered just below the surface. And like the storm brewing outside their home that fateful January night, it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. It began innocently enough, or so it seemed. Scarlett Calloway had been living under her uncle's roof for just over a month when she first noticed the change in him. It was a slight shift, subtle enough that no one else seemed to pick up on it. Emmett Calloway, the confident, collected tycoon, had begun to linger at the dinner table a little longer, his gaze distant, his attention fleeting. His phone buzzed more frequently, and his responses were quick but guarded. Scarlett, ever the observant journalist in training, filed these details away, her curiosity piqued. The night everything began to unravel was November 20, 2022. The Calloways had attended a lavish fundraiser at a downtown Charleston gallery. Scarlett had come along reluctantly, feeling out of place among the glittering dresses and polished smiles of Charleston's elite. She had wandered through the gallery's halls, admiring the art but longing for the night to end. It was then that she saw him, her uncle, standing in a dimly lit corner with a woman she didn't recognize. Scarlett paused, her stomach tightening as she watched the scene unfold. Emmett leaned in close to the woman, his hand brushing her arm in a gesture far too intimate for mere acquaintance. Scarlett recognized the look in his eyes. It wasn't the cool, detached gaze of a businessman. It was desire. The woman, striking and composed, laughed softly, leaning into him. Scarlett's pulse quickened. Her uncle, the man she had idolized, the man she had believed to be a pillar of virtue, was betraying her aunt. Scarlett stepped back into the shadows, her heart pounding. She didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, she spent the rest of the night watching them from afar, noting every subtle touch, every stolen glance. By the time the Calloways returned home, Scarlett's mind was spinning with questions she couldn't yet answer. The discovery shattered something in Scarlett. The pedestal she had placed her uncle on was gone, and in its place was a man whose actions betrayed the image she had so carefully constructed. But alongside the shock and betrayal, another feeling began to stir, something darker, more dangerous. She couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he had looked at that woman. She hated it. She hated her. In the days that followed, Scarlett became consumed by her need to know more. She scoured social media, searching for any trace of the woman from the gallery. It didn't take long for her to find her, Victoria Ashcroft, an art curator based in Savannah. Victoria's online presence was polished and curated, her posts filled with images of gallery openings and abstract paintings. Scarlett hated her even more. But Scarlett's obsession wasn't just about Victoria, it was about Emmett. The uncle she had admired her entire life had become the center of her thoughts in a way she couldn't control. She began to notice things she hadn't before, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, the pride in his eyes when he praised her accomplishments. She replayed their conversations in her mind, searching for signs of something more. Unbeknownst to Scarlett, Victoria had her own doubts about her relationship with Emmett. Their affair, which had begun with stolen glances and intellectual banter, had deepened over the years. Victoria was not blind to the constraints of their relationship, she knew Emmett's family came first. But recently, she had grown tired of the secrecy. She wanted more than brief moments in hotel rooms and hurried text messages. She wanted Emmett to choose her. Victoria's demands for clarity began to weigh on Emmett. He wasn't ready to leave Cassandra, not just for the sake of his image, but for the stability she provided. And yet, Victoria's presence had become a necessary escape from the monotony of his life. He couldn't imagine giving her up. Meanwhile, the tension in the Calloway household grew. Scarlett's behavior became erratic. She withdrew from conversations at the dinner table, her once bright demeanor replaced by quiet intensity. She began spending more time at her laptop, her eyes fixed on the screen as she delved deeper into Victoria's life. Cassandra noticed the changes in both her husband and Scarlett. Emmett's absences had become more frequent, and Scarlett seemed preoccupied, her gaze often distant. Cassandra's instincts told her something was wrong, but when she voiced her concerns to Emmett, he brushed them off. "Work is hectic," he'd say. "Scarlett's just adjusting to everything." But Cassandra knew better. Scarlett's fixation on Emmett reached new heights in early December. She began altering her appearance, choosing outfits she thought might catch his eye. She lingered in the study when he worked late, offering to bring him coffee or help organize his files. Emmett, though uncomfortable, dismissed it as youthful enthusiasm. He didn't see the danger lurking beneath her actions. Scarlett's jealousy of Victoria grew with each passing day. She imagined what it would be like to replace her, to be the one Emmett turned to. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. She convinced herself that what she felt wasn't wrong, that her uncle needed her in a way no one else could understand. By mid-December, the cracks in the Calloway family's foundation were becoming impossible to ignore. Scarlett's obsession with Emmett was no longer hidden, and Cassandra's unease was growing. Emmett, trapped between Victoria's demands and Scarlett's increasingly bold behavior, began to feel the walls closing in. What none of them realized was that the storm brewing within their family would soon break, unleashing a series of events that would lead to tragedy. Scarlett's discovery of Emmett's affair had been the spark, but the fire it ignited was far from contained. It was only a matter of time before the truth erupted, destroying everything in its path. By December 2022, the Calloway mansion in Charleston had become a pressure cooker of secrets, guilt, and unspoken desires. Scarlett's obsession with her uncle had evolved into something she could no longer suppress, and Emmett, though initially resistant, found himself unable to fully distance himself from her growing intensity. The tension rippled through the family, unsettling even those unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. It was a quiet evening, just before Christmas, when Scarlett decided to confront Emmett. The house was still. Cassandra had taken Reed and Isla to visit her parents, and Emmett was alone in his study. Scarlett saw the opportunity and seized it. Knocking softly on the door, she entered without waiting for a response. Emmett glanced up from his desk, his brow furrowing in mild irritation. "Scarlett, it's late," he said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "I need to talk to you," she said, closing the door behind her. Her voice wavered, but there was a determination in her eyes that caught him off guard. "It's important." Emmett leaned back in his chair, gesturing for her to sit, but Scarlett remained standing, her hands clenched at her sides. "I know about her," she said bluntly, her gaze boring into him. "Victoria. I saw you with her at the gallery." For a moment, Emmett said nothing. His face betrayed a flicker of shock, but he quickly masked it with a practiced calm. "That's none of your concern," he replied, his tone firm. "You shouldn't have been spying." Scarlett's composure cracked. "Spying? You're my uncle, and you're cheating on Aunt Cassandra. How can you act like this is normal?" Her voice trembled with a mix of anger and something else, something darker. Emmett sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Scarlett, I'm not going to explain myself to you. This is complicated." "No," she said, stepping closer. "You don't get to dismiss me. I've always looked up to you. I thought you were better than this." Her words cut deep, but it was the look in her eyes that unsettled Emmett. It wasn't just anger, it was longing. Before he could respond, Scarlett spoke again, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I understand you, Emmett. I see you in a way she never could. You don't have to hide from me." Emmett froze, the weight of her words sinking in. "Scarlett, this is," he began, but she interrupted him. "I can give you what you need," she said, her voice trembling with both fear and conviction. "You don't have to feel empty anymore." Emmett stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This conversation ends now," he said, his tone sharp. But Scarlett was undeterred. She moved closer, her proximity sending a wave of discomfort through him. "I'm not a child, Emmett," she said softly. "I know what I want. And I think, you do too." In that moment, something broke inside Emmett. Perhaps it was the months of guilt and frustration, or the relentless pressure from all sides. Whatever it was, it made him falter. Scarlett reached out, her hand brushing against his, and for a split second, he didn't pull away. That fleeting moment was enough to tip the balance. What began as a gesture of reassurance spiraled into something neither of them could control. The boundaries shattered, and Emmett crossed a line he could never uncross. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and suffocating guilt. Scarlett, emboldened by their secret, began seeking more of Emmett's attention. She lingered in the study late into the night, found excuses to be near him, and her demeanor shifted. She radiated a quiet confidence, as though she had claimed something that was hers. Emmett, on the other hand, was unraveling. The weight of his betrayal bore down on him, fracturing his carefully constructed facade. He avoided Cassandra more than ever, unable to meet her eyes without feeling the sting of his actions. His interactions with Victoria became strained as well, her demands for clarity clashing with his crumbling composure. Cassandra noticed everything, the furtive glances between Emmett and Scarlett, the way Scarlett's presence seemed to linger wherever Emmett was. Her instincts told her something was wrong, but she couldn't piece it together. When she confronted Emmett one evening, his response was curt. "You're imagining things, Cass," he said, brushing past her. But the seed of suspicion had already taken root. As Christmas approached, the tension in the Calloway household was palpable. Family dinners, once filled with laughter and lively conversation, were now strained and awkward. Reed and Isla, though too young to understand the details, sensed the shift and retreated into their own worlds. Scarlett, however, was undeterred. She saw Cassandra as an obstacle, a barrier standing between her and Emmett. Her resentment toward her aunt grew, fueling her determination to claim what she believed was hers. Scarlett convinced herself that she was the only one who truly understood Emmett, the only one who could make him whole. For Emmett, the walls were closing in. Victoria's demands for commitment were becoming more forceful, Cassandra's suspicions more pronounced, and Scarlett's obsession more intense. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a collapsing bridge, with no way to escape the impending fall. By the time New Year's Eve arrived, the Calloway family was teetering on the brink of collapse. Cassandra had begun keeping a closer eye on Scarlett, determined to uncover the truth. Scarlett, in turn, became more reckless, emboldened by her secret with Emmett. The cracks in their family's foundation were now impossible to ignore. The perfect facade of the Calloways, once admired by all of Charleston, was disintegrating. And as the clock struck midnight, ushering in a new year, none of them could have known that their carefully concealed secrets were about to explode, leaving nothing but devastation in their wake. By mid-January 2023, the Calloway mansion was no longer a home but a battleground of secrets and lies. The once grand estate in Charleston stood silent and heavy, its ornate walls bearing witness to the storm brewing inside. Scarlett's obsession with her uncle had reached a fever pitch, Emmett was crumbling under the weight of guilt and pressure, and Cassandra's quiet suspicion had turned into a silent hunt for the truth. The tension was unbearable, and it was only a matter of time before everything shattered. It was a cold, rainy evening on January 15, 2023, when Scarlett decided she couldn't wait any longer. Emmett had been avoiding her for days, his guilt and fear manifesting in late nights at work and minimal interaction. Scarlett, however, was relentless. She had convinced herself that she was the only one who could truly save him, the only one who understood him. And if he wouldn't choose her willingly, she would force his hand. Scarlett waited until the rest of the family was occupied. Cassandra had taken Isla to a friend's house, and Reed was upstairs with his headphones on. She knocked on the door to Emmett's study but didn't wait for an answer before stepping inside. Emmett looked up from the papers on his desk, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "Scarlett, what is it?" "I'm busy," he said, his voice strained. But Scarlett wasn't deterred. She closed the door behind her, the sound of the lock clicking loud in the stillness. "We need to talk," she said firmly, her tone more confident than she felt. Emmett frowned, leaning back in his chair. "This isn't the time, Scarlett. Go to bed." No, she said, stepping closer. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. I can't do this anymore. You can't keep ignoring me. He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. What do you want from me, Scarlet? This, whatever you think this is, it has to stop. Scarlet's expression hardened. You don't mean that, she said quietly. I know you don't. You're just scared. But you don't have to be, not with me. Emmett stood, his chair scraping against the floor. Enough, he snapped, his voice echoing in the small room. You're my niece. This is wrong, and it needs to end. Right now. But Scarlet wasn't listening. Her eyes burned with a mix of desperation and defiance. Wrong, she repeated, her voice rising. You didn't think it was wrong before. You didn't think it was wrong when you held me, when you kissed me. That was a mistake. Emmett shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. It should never have happened. Tears welled in Scarlet's eyes, but they didn't fall. Instead, her face twisted with anger. You're lying, she hissed. You're lying to yourself because you're afraid of what people will think. But I'm not afraid, Emmett. I love you. I need you. Emmett's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Scarlet, you don't understand what you're doing. This isn't love, it's obsession. Scarlet shook her head furiously. No, it's real. It's more real than whatever you have with Cassandra or her, she spat, venom dripping from her voice. I saw you with her. Do you think she loves you like I do? Do you think she understands you? Enough. Emmett roared, his composure snapping entirely. You don't know what you're saying. Yes, I do. Scarlet yelled back, stepping closer. Her voice dropped, low and dangerous. And if you don't choose me, I'll make sure everyone knows. Cassandra, Victoria, everyone. Those words hit Emmett like a blow. The threat hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. He felt the walls closing in, his entire world teetering on the edge of collapse. And then something inside him broke. In a blur of panic and rage, Emmett lunged forward, his hands closing around Scarlet's throat. Her eyes widened in shock, her hands clawing at his as she tried to pull away, but his grip was ironclad, fueled by adrenaline and fear. Stop, he shouted, his voice trembling. Stop threatening me. Scarlet's struggles weakened as the seconds ticked by. The reality of what he was doing began to dawn on Emmett, but by then, it was too late. When he finally released her, she crumpled to the floor, her body limp and lifeless. Emmett stumbled back, his hands shaking as he stared at Scarlet's motionless form. His mind raced, a cacophony of guilt, shock, and denial. No, he whispered, his voice barely audible. What have I done? For several long minutes, Emmett sat frozen in his chair, his head in his hands. The rain outside beat against the windows, relentless rhythm that matched the pounding of his heart. He didn't hear Cassandra return until it was too late. Emmett? Her voice called from the hallway. Are you in there? The door opened, and Cassandra stepped inside. Her eyes fell on Scarlet's body first, and a scream tore from her throat. Scarlet, she cried, rushing to her niece's side. When she turned to Emmett, her face was a mask of horror. What did you do? But Emmett couldn't answer. He couldn't even look at her. The perfect man she thought she married was gone, replaced by a shell of himself. Minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air, flashing lights illuminating the rain-soaked night. Police officers swarmed the mansion, their voices sharp and commanding. Emmett was silent as they led him away in handcuffs, his once imposing figure now hunched and defeated. Scarlet's body was carefully carried out under the watchful eyes of Cassandra and her children, who had gathered at the top of the staircase, their faces pale with fear and confusion. The Calloway family, once admired by all of Charleston, had fallen. And the storm that raged that night was nothing compared to the devastation yet to come. The Calloway mansion, once the epitome of Southern charm and prosperity, was now a crime scene. Police tape cordoned off the perimeter, and investigators moved methodically through the house, documenting every detail. The once pristine study, where Scarlett's life had been violently cut short, was now a stark tableau of tragedy. Rain continued to drizzle, a mournful backdrop to the chaos unfolding inside. Leading the investigation was Detective Lila Knox, a veteran of Charleston's police force known for her meticulous approach and unrelenting pursuit of justice. The moment she stepped into the study, she sensed that this was no simple domestic dispute. The scene was too personal, too deliberate. And then there was Emmett Calloway, the composed real estate magnate turned hollow-eyed suspect. The first round of interviews revealed the fractured dynamics within the Calloway household. Cassandra, still reeling from the shock, struggled to compose herself as she recounted the events leading up to that night. We were just trying to help Scarlett," she said, her voice trembling. She was going through a rough time. She came to live with us because her parents' divorce was hard on her." Detective Knox nodded but didn't press her further. It was clear Cassandra was holding something back, her tear-streaked face a mask of anguish and suspicion. Reed and Isla, the Calloway children, had little to offer. Reed, stoic and withdrawn, admitted he had noticed tension in the house but chalked it up to his father's busy schedule. Isla, too young to understand the complexities, could only say she had heard her mother and Scarlett arguing earlier in the week. It was Emmett's interview, however, that raised the most red flags. His answers were vague, his demeanor flat. When asked to explain what happened that night, he recited a rehearsed-sounding version of events. "She came into my study," he began, his voice devoid of emotion. "She was upset. We argued. I tried to calm her down, but it got out of hand." Detective Knox raised an eyebrow. "Out of hand? In what way, Mr. Calloway?" Emmett's jaw tightened. "She threatened to hurt herself. I tried to stop her, but," he trailed off, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. It was a flimsy excuse, and Knox knew it. But she also knew better than to push too hard too soon. The forensic team quickly uncovered evidence that painted a more disturbing picture. Scarlett's body showed clear signs of strangulation, and there were faint bruises on her arms consistent with a struggle. DNA samples taken from her fingernails matched Emmett's, further contradicting his claims of a non-violent confrontation. In Scarlett's room, investigators found a journal hidden beneath her mattress. Its pages were filled with confessions and reflections that grew darker as the months progressed. Detective Knox flipped through the entries, her brow furrowing as she read. "I can't stand the way she looks at him. She doesn't deserve him. He needs someone who truly understands him, and that's me. He's been distant lately. I know it's because of her. But I won't let her take him from me." The final entry, dated January 15th, sent a chill down Knox's spine. "Tonight, everything changes. He'll have to choose her or me." As Knox pieced together the timeline, another name emerged, Victoria Ashcroft, the art curator from Savannah. Text messages recovered from Scarlett's phone revealed a growing obsession with uncovering Victoria's relationship with Emmett. Scarlett had spent hours scouring social media and public records, building a mental dossier on the woman she saw as her rival. When Victoria was brought in for questioning, she was visibly nervous. Her polished demeanor faltered as she admitted to her affair with Emmett. "It started 2 years ago," she confessed, her voice trembling. "But it wasn't serious at first. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to hurt anyone." Knox leaned forward. "Did you know Scarlett was aware of your relationship?" Victoria's eyes widened. "No," she said quickly. I didn't even know she existed until recently. Emmett never mentioned her. But Scarlett's journal and the text messages told a different story. Scarlett had not only known about Victoria but had also been monitoring her closely. She had followed Victoria to events, taken photos of her interactions with Emmett, and even confronted her anonymously through cryptic messages. The final piece of the puzzle came from Cassandra. After days of quiet observation and questioning, she finally broke down during her third interview with Knox. "I knew something was wrong," she admitted, her voice raw with emotion. Scarlett, she wasn't herself. She became possessive, angry. And Emmett, he wasn't the man I married anymore. I heard them arguing that night. I should have gone in. I should have stopped it. Knox placed a comforting hand on Cassandra's shoulder. "What did you hear, Cassandra? Anything specific?" Cassandra closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. She said she would ruin him. She said if he didn't choose her, she'd destroy our family. With Cassandra's testimony, Scarlett's journal, and the forensic evidence, a grim narrative began to take shape. Scarlett had confronted Emmett, threatening to expose his affair with Victoria if he didn't choose her. In a moment of panic and rage, Emmett had lashed out, his actions culminating in her death. The once pristine image of the Calloway family was now irreparably tarnished. What had started as a tragic domestic dispute was revealed to be a web of forbidden desires, jealousy, and betrayal. Knox knew the case wasn't just about solving a crime, it was about unraveling the complex, messy truth behind the Calloway legacy. On January 20th, Emmett was formally charged with second-degree murder. As he was led out of the mansion in handcuffs, reporters swarmed the scene, their cameras capturing every moment. Cassandra watched from the doorway, her face pale but resolute. The man she had once trusted implicitly was now a stranger, and her family was in ruins. For Detective Knox, the case was far from over. There were still details to uncover, loose ends to tie up. But one thing was clear, the Calloway family, once the pride of Charleston, would never recover from the truth that had been exposed within their walls. The courtroom was packed to capacity on the first day of Emmett Calloway's trial, held in the federal courthouse in downtown Charleston. Journalists and spectators alike filled the benches, eager to witness the dramatic conclusion to a case that had gripped the community for months. Once hailed as a pillar of society, Emmett now sat at the defendant's table, his tailored suit doing little to mask the weight of disgrace that hung over him. His face was pale, his expression somber, as he avoided meeting the eyes of anyone in the room. The prosecution wasted no time in painting a damning picture of Emmett. They described him as a man who had allowed his forbidden desires and illicit relationships to spiral out of control, culminating in the tragic death of his niece. The lead prosecutor, a sharp and eloquent woman named Jessica Pryor, delivered a searing opening statement that set the tone for the trial. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Pryor began, her voice calm but piercing, "this case is not just about a tragic accident. It is about power, manipulation, and betrayal. It is about a man who took advantage of his position of trust and responsibility, who allowed his selfish impulses to destroy a young woman's life." Over the next several days, Pryor called witnesses to the stand, building a meticulous case against Emmett. Forensic experts testified about the physical evidence, the bruises on Scarlett's neck, the DNA under her fingernails, and the fibers from Emmett's clothing found on her body. Scarlett's journal, discovered in her room, was presented to the jury, its haunting entries read aloud. "She wrote this just hours before her death," Pryor said, holding up the journal. "Tonight, everything changes. He'll have to choose her or me." The courtroom was silent, save for the scribbling of reporters' pens. Cassandra Calloway's testimony proved to be one of the most emotional moments of the trial. Dressed in black, her voice trembled as she recounted the night she found Scarlett's body and the months of tension that had preceded it. "I knew something was wrong," Cassandra said, her eyes welling with tears. "I noticed the way Scarlett looked at Emmett, the way he avoided her. But I never imagined. I never thought it would come to this. Emmett's defense team, led by the seasoned attorney Paul Westbrook, faced an uphill battle. Their strategy focused on portraying Scarlett as a troubled young woman whose obsession with her uncle had clouded her judgment and led to an accidental death. This was a family tragedy, Westbrook argued during his opening statement. My client, Emmett Calloway, is not a murderer. He is a man who made mistakes, yes, but he did not intend to harm Scarlett. The prosecution wants you to believe this was deliberate, but the evidence simply does not support that. The defense called character witnesses to attest to Emmett's reputation as a devoted family man and successful businessman. They also tried to cast doubt on the journal entries, suggesting that they were the writings of a mentally unstable young woman. When Emmett himself took the stand, the courtroom held its breath. His voice broke as he admitted to his affair with Scarlett and expressed remorse for his actions. I failed her, he said, tears streaming down his face. I failed my wife, my children, and my family. But I never meant for this to happen. I loved Scarlett, but not in the way she thought. I was trying to protect her, and I lost control. His emotional testimony left some in the courtroom visibly moved, but the prosecution was quick to dismantle his claims during cross-examination. You say you loved Scarlett, Pryor said, her voice cutting through the tension. But isn't it true that your actions were driven not by love, but by selfishness? Isn't it true that you acted not to protect her, but to protect yourself? Emmett hesitated, his composure faltering. I don't know, he stammered. It was the moment the prosecution needed to solidify their case. After 3 weeks of testimony and deliberations, the jury returned with their verdict. On a crisp spring morning, the foreman stood and delivered the words that would seal Emmett's fate, guilty of second-degree murder. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the judge sentenced Emmett to 25 years to life in prison. Emmett's head dropped, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the decision. Cassandra sat silently in the gallery, her face pale and expressionless. The family she had once fought so hard to protect was now irrevocably broken. The fallout from the trial extended far beyond the courthouse. The Calloway name, once synonymous with success and prestige, was now a cautionary tale of betrayal and tragedy. The mansion in Charleston was sold, its grandeur forever tainted by the events that had transpired within its walls. Cassandra filed for divorce shortly after the trial, taking Reed and Isla to live with her parents in Savannah. Determined to rebuild her life, she focused on giving her children the stability they needed to heal. But the scars of what had happened would linger, shaping their lives in ways they couldn't yet understand. Victoria Ashcroft, though cleared of any involvement in Scarlett's death, found her reputation damaged by her connection to Emmett. She resigned from her position at the museum and moved to a quieter life, far from the spotlight. For Detective Lila Knox, the case remained one of the most haunting of her career. Though justice had been served, the tragic waste of life and the complexity of the emotions involved left a lingering sense of sadness. The trial of Emmett Calloway became a national sensation, sparking debates about power, obsession, and the fragility of family bonds. Documentaries and true crime podcasts dissected every detail of the case, transforming Scarlett into a symbol of lost potential and a cautionary figure for those caught in dangerous emotional entanglements. In the end, the Calloway tragedy stood as a grim reminder of the destructive power of secrets, lies, and unchecked desires. The mansion's walls, once echoing with laughter and warmth, now stood silent, a monument to a family's fall from grace. Months had passed since the trial, but the weight of the Calloway tragedy lingered like a shadow over Charleston. The stately Georgian mansion, once a beacon of success and privilege, now stood empty, its grandeur dulled by the knowledge of what had transpired within its walls. Neighbors avoided speaking of the family that once seemed untouchable, and whispers of scandal followed the Calloway name wherever it was mentioned. Cassandra Calloway, now living quietly in Savannah with her children, had begun to rebuild her life. Despite the pain of betrayal and loss, she found solace in her children's resilience. Reed, always introspective, had taken up painting, channeling his emotions into stark, haunting works of art. Isla, though still young, had grown more serious, her childhood innocence fractured by the events she couldn't fully understand. Cassandra herself had turned inward, reflecting on the years she had spent holding her family together while cracks formed beneath the surface. The guilt she carried for not seeing the signs sooner weighed heavily on her. If I had acted differently, she often thought, would Scarlett still be alive? But deep down, she knew the choices others had made, their secrets, their desires, were beyond her control. Emmett Calloway began serving his sentence in a state penitentiary, far from the life of luxury and influence he once knew. In the sterile monotony of prison, he had plenty of time to reflect on the decisions that led to his downfall. He wrote letters to Cassandra, pleading for forgiveness, but they went unanswered. His children never visited, and he couldn't blame them. He had destroyed their family and tarnished their name. Scarlett's memory, meanwhile, became a point of contention. To some, she was a victim of manipulation and betrayal. To others, her own obsession and choices had set the tragedy in motion. True crime podcasts and documentaries dissected every angle of the case, turning her story into a cautionary tale of unchecked emotions and the destructive power of forbidden desires. The Calloway tragedy also left an indelible mark on the Charleston community. The wealthy elite who once celebrated Emmett now distanced themselves from his memory, eager to erase their association with him. The events forced the community to confront uncomfortable questions about power, privilege, and the facade of perfection so many families worked tirelessly to maintain. Detective Lila Knox, who had been instrumental in uncovering the truth, found herself revisiting the case long after it had closed. Justice was served, she would remind herself, yet the tragedy never sat easy with her. Scarlett had been so young, so full of potential, and her life had been stolen not just by one act of violence but by the cascade of lies and betrayals that preceded it. The Calloway family's story stood as a stark reminder of the dangers of secrets, power imbalances, and unresolved emotional wounds. At its heart, it wasn't just a tale of crime, it was a tale of human weakness. It asked difficult questions. What drives people to betray those they love? How far can obsession twist our understanding of right and wrong? And can any family, no matter how perfect they seem, survive the weight of their darkest truths? As the mansion's grand iron gates rusted over time, it became a symbol of the fragility of human connections. The Calloway name faded from public consciousness, but the lessons of their tragedy lingered, serving as a somber warning for generations to come. What do you think was the turning point in this story? Could anyone have stopped the tragedy from unfolding? Do you see Emmett as a victim of circumstance or the true villain of the story? Scarlett's actions were undeniably fueled by obsession, but was she entirely at fault? Or did her environment and relationships shape her choices? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like and share the video to keep the conversation going. And don't forget to subscribe for more gripping tales that uncover the darkest corners of human nature.